to be speaking about my work at DiverSci. And for those of you who don't know me, I also feel like maybe I didn't introduce myself. My name is Lewis Hou. I'm based in Scotland, in Edinburgh in particular, but most of our work is across particularly the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And so, for example, this picture comes from Oban on the west coast, just to prove that we've got some of those gorgeous landscapes and very rural communities, and we even have sun every once in a while as well. And so I really wanted to structure this, and it's a really good time for me to share some of the work and processes of.
Okay.
Oh, am I back?
You were frozen just a second.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, please do give me a message if that is the case. I don't know where I got to now. I think, yeah, so it's a good time for me to look at systems change because I've just started alongside our wider work with Science Ceilidh, and I'll explain what a Ceilidh is in a second as well. But I've also just started a fellowship, which is exploring this topic and taking a bit more time to reflect and think about maybe a bit more of an international dimension of this work too. So really good to have this discussion today. I guess the first thing is, so Science Ceilidh, I started back in 2016 as a kind of going from a project. Now, Ceilidh has a few different meanings. So on one level, it is Scottish traditional folk dance. I play fiddle, and I almost in another life now. And the nicest thing about Ceilidh traditions is it's all about bringing people together. It's all very participatory. The whole idea is about being able to everyone to share a story or a piece and dancing together, not having to be an expert. And at the time, I'd been working in science communication for a very long time, but acknowledging the fact that it generally preached to the converted. So people who are already what we would now call have high science capital, who are particularly privileged. And the nice thing about Ceilidh traditions, and all cultures have some sort of folk traditions in terms of music and dance and culture, is it's about bringing people together to share knowledge. And we really wanted to bring this philosophy into science engagement, and that began very literally. So I was a professional, had a professional Ceilidh band, so we played for dancers. And again, what we really enjoyed was literally mixing and taking this kind of cross-transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach to learning. And so writing dancers to explore different science concepts, bring in different communities, particularly rural communities, with researchers and music and musicians together. Now, whilst this remains a small component of the work we do, we now lean into the Gaelic meaning of the word Ceilidh, which Gaelic being one of our national languages in Scotland, and in Gaelic it means to bring together. So it isn't dancing so much, it's actually just the convening of people, again, to share together. And so we have a few different programs now. We're very much practitioners. We help deliver programs. But as I'll talk about a bit more, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've really been focused a lot more on funding and thinking about how we can fund communities across Scotland to lead their own work, lead their own engagement, and particularly around research and developing knowledge. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but our mission is a Scotland where everyone's creativity, curiosity, and well-being are fundamentally valued. We're a social enterprise, which means that all our profits are invested back into the organization. And we also summarize what we do. Half our work is in the cultural sector. So actually, we wouldn't call ourselves a science communication or science engagement organization. We're a cultural organization that looks at culture and knowledge democracy. Now, the last definition I'm going to throw at you is there's a model. So the idea of knowledge democracy is this idea. So you have the democratization of knowledge. So this is the idea that, researchers are producing knowledge and we're going to make that much more accessible. So very often this is the bread and butter of science engagement. How do we make this more accessible? How do we change the pathways to make it more two-way? But knowledge democracy, as opposed to the democratization of knowledge, which is still very important, asks the wider question, well, whose knowledge is fundamentally valued? And what is supported in terms of generating impact and learning together. And I guess it asks the more critical question, and maybe this particularly feels important at the times of why is sometimes only certain forms of knowledge valued, and that has such an important context from an equitable perspective, from a global perspective, understanding the incredibly undiverse ways of, that research can happen, and the problematic ways that research can happen historically, and what is valued and what is. And so this is a big part of the work that we do in all of our programs. One small example, so we all count ourselves as what we call an intermediary organization. So we're independent. As I said, we work very closely with lots of different organizations and universities, but we are separate as an organization. And that this role as an intermediary gives us quite a lot of freedom. And I think this is a really important thing that we are trying to kind of offer as kind of one of the key roles that is required in a world where we want to support communities to lead their own cultural activities, lead their own knowledge development and research. And so an example of this is one of our longest term partnerships, for example, is with New Scots. So this is a term that we use for people from all sorts of backgrounds who are now temporarily or for long term at home in Scotland. And so many of the people that we work with are from kind of refugee or asylum seeking backgrounds, for example. And with this partnership, this is a partnership over 7, 8, 9 years that began, that wasn't funded to begin with. It was voluntary that we decided to work with, particularly in the Edinburgh community, with our partner organization, Multicultural Family Base. And over time, they were just telling us what they needed. And very often, to begin with, it was much more focused on the cultural activities. So they wanted to share their dances. We were able, obviously, to support Scottish dancers and have these kind of cultural exchanges. But they were really keen for us to work with their young people. And over time, that developed a program which was working particularly with a youth group, looking at how STEM could be a tool to support broader outcomes, not just thinking about young people's interest in STEM, but actually well-being, integration, confidence. And so we talk a lot about this kind of people over program. And so we were able to then build a project around that based on what they needed and respond to that. And similarly, with particularly the men's group, for example, a lot of the men came from technical backgrounds. They were architects and engineers, but they were really struggling with just building that kind of understanding of what that type of work looked like in Scotland. And so again, they came to us and said, well, you've got connections with engineers, and could you help build a kind of peer program? And so we developed a program funded by the Royal Academy of Engineering. Now, I'll give you this example because for me, we talk a lot about being quite agnostic about what we do. And so if you are coming from as a researcher, and very often we are working with researchers, very often you engage with communities, but very often how you engage with communities has to involve your research in some way, right? If you're a biologist, the ways that you can support are around biology, whereas the role of our organization as an agnostic connector or broker or intermediary is that we can actually just, depending on what the community needed, we can be that bridge. And we had the connections with universities, we have connections with funders, and we have connections with community organizations and cultural organizations to be able to help this happen. So I guess I want to give this as a small example of this kind of really on the ground work and actually how long these relationships can be. And even though, for example, our work with MCFB, Multicultural Family Base, is not funded, for us, it's a core commitment that we are able to kind of keep working. I actually saw some of the young people that I've known for years now just last week to play football with them. And so it gives us a little bit more of this social commitment about how we can work with communities beyond thinking about it as projects. And if you're interested in this type of work, we have an action research program called Curiosity in Action, which is open to everyone. I can put the link in afterwards. And again, this is looking at this kind of scaling this model of how science engagement can be a tool for kind of youth work, community-based work, which again, focus on the kind of social impact rather than science literacy or trust in science or science careers. So that leads us, I guess we've been doing this work for a very long time. And a few years ago, just after the lockdown, the COVID pandemic, we reached out with the British Science Association, who were funded by the Wellcome Trust, and to have this, think about this question. So normally, traditionally, research happens in a way where researchers have an idea, you know, and again, I'm exaggerating to a certain degree, but a researcher has an idea, they get funding for the institution, and very often they then find communities to work with. At best, this is kind of collaborative, but usually it's the researcher that has the most power and who decides the questions. Whereas, and at its worst, particularly for a lot of the communities that we work with, it can feel quite extractive or opaque, right? So it's a bit like a community, a researcher comes into a community, asks loads of questions, takes all this information, and then you don't see what happens next. There's no communication, or you don't read the papers, you don't have that understanding of the impact that you have. And it feels, as I said, it can be very extractive. And this is, generally speaking, and again, I'm exaggerating, but even with the best will in the world, very often this feels like how the dynamic is. And so we were asked to think about, first as consultants, but then as support agency, to think about, well, how would research look like if we went directly to communities, particularly communities who are marginalized, who are underrepresented in research, who not necessarily had funding before. What would it look like if we went directly to communities to ask them, well, what are the questions around mental well-being that you're interested in exploring? They get the funding, so it goes directly to them. We're still connecting them with researchers. We're asking them to build partnerships with researchers. And our role is to help kind of matchmake and kind of make this a very relational participatory process where, again, it's not just a simple kind of pairing or paying for a consultant, but actually developing and learning together and much more focused on the process. And so that's when we developed initially the Ideas Fund, which is funded by Wellcome. And that one has about 25 projects across the Highlands and Islands, the very north and most rural parts of Scotland, that we fund to about, and this is not insignificant money, I should say, well, maybe in research terms, but it's about £1.5 million worth of community investment that goes directly to communities between these projects. And we also have our climate change network, which was then funded separately with UK Research and Innovation. And again, looking at much more small scale funding, so £5,000, but very focused on relationship building with partners. But again, that money went directly to the community partners, not the researcher. And so this is what I'm going to talk a little bit more about, because this is when we start thinking about when funding processes, systems, actually very often these are the biggest blockers to equitable science engagement. And actually, I didn't give you my definition of system change, but actually, I guess system change to me thinks about, if we think about things like systemic issues like racism, patriarchy, these are things that I think the way that I define it is if you take away, if I could change everyone's opinion on racism and they weren't racist or they were no longer misogynist, for example, or ableist, it's just, even if I change everyone's mindset, there will be ways that practices, the way that things are valued, the ways that institutions operate, which still oppress people of color or disabled people or women. And so that to me highlights that kind of key part of the system. These are things that are beyond people's individual opinions. So what does that mean in practice? When we designed this grant scheme, we spent a lot of time co-developing the process with community partners in the first place. We learned a lot from our first round, where a lot of my time was focused on so again, we funded groups who've never had funding before. So we spent a lot of time working with different stakeholders to identify appropriately underrepresented groups. And actually, very often I was on the phone call helping them write their application and think about actually why they might want to work with researchers if this is appropriate. And spend a lot of time triaging this support, whilst appreciating that even in the community sector, there are some groups that are very good at applying for funding, a lot of charities that are very used to this way of working. And so I had to focus a lot of my time thinking about, well, okay, who needs the most support? And then also, for example, that was great, but in round two, what we really understood is actually even that was still disappointing. It was obviously a competitive fund at the end of the day. And so we ended up having a model where we made it as light touch as possible. So if you're interested, you're curious, you had a bit of an idea, you didn't have to have any partnership in place. And then we funded with a community panel. And again, having communities who were involved in this in the decision-making, the funder was not involved in the decision-making, and we held that process. And then the idea around this is that we could then actually allocate, at this point, 7 incubator projects, which we could then give, I think it was £2,000. So it was kind of a chunk of money to actually just have a bit of time and my support to help them build a full proposal. And then those proposals would then end up being either £25,000 all the way up to £85,000 directly for their partnerships. So that was important that we were funding that time and that development, appreciating that those, again, who are most marginalized don't have very often this time. We did quite an extensive matching process. And for me, this was not just a simple process of just like, okay, what does the community want? Great, this researcher does this. It was much more relational. And so we spent a lot of time enabling the communities to have conversations with researchers, different researchers. And very often what would happen is, for example, even if the community group had an idea about what research was, and again, very often they had very fixed ideas or even negative ideas of what research could be. I'm looking at time, I'm running out of time, that's okay. We would spend a lot of time kind of trying to balance those power dynamics, making sure the researchers that we supported them understood the aims of the program, that they weren't themselves expecting a different type of power dynamic, which was, we were doing something very different and it was uncomfortable for the researchers and how we could support them. And very often, I would say one of the key learning was that very often it was a match of values that was the most important thing that made the communities decide which researchers they want to work with. And actually, very often, one example was that the one researcher came into the conversation being like, I live locally, I can't help you do what you want to do, in terms of the kind of call out. But there was such a strong match in terms of values because they live locally. And actually, through that conversation, they developed a completely different idea. And it was really good that that idea was seen really valuable. And actually, that was the direction the project went. And again, for us to hold this space and be as flexible as we could to enable this emergence to develop. So we didn't have to do this classic, set all the outcomes from the very beginning of this process. We work very closely with different universities, but actually, and that again helps us balance maybe some of the kind of institutional pressures. If you work with one university, there's going to be a bit of a kind of, sometimes, you want the potential the co-opting of this program. So again, it was really useful for us to work with different public engagement people, mediators, to help us try and find the right researchers. And actually, we also funded independent research as well, so those who weren't tied to institutions. And we spent a lot of time, once these projects were matched, building these values and thinking about how the partnerships can work and developing a program that was equitable, that was led by the communities, but also benefited the researcher. And finally, of course, these projects, as they go, partnership working is very difficult, as you know, and so we provide a lot of support and mediation as a kind of relational advocate. So we obviously work as a community organization. We work a lot with researchers, so we understand the two different languages, and we're embedded with the funder, even though we don't do the grant giving. And that was a really useful position to be in, to be able to play and support and bring a very authentic sense of support. And when partnerships, sometimes they did break down or have challenges, again, for us to be a kind of trusted person to go to that wasn't the funder, but obviously worked very closely with funders to be able to share, mediate as needed to kind of find the right solutions. And that was really important. And our wider role as an organization was appreciating that project-based funding is problematic. And so a lot of our time was then also focused on capacity building. So how could we leave these projects and these organizations with the support needed for the next step to make sure that they ended well? And very often this would enable us, for example, if groups have never had funding before, to help them get the structures so they could hold more funding. We would send them lots of funding, different opportunities, and help them write the new funding applications. And then the most important thing in some ways, and actually links to this community of practice, is that we had a very close-knit community of practice between the practitioners. Highlands and Islands is a massive space. It's incredibly rural. It's about over 50% of the landmass of Scotland. And so connectivity is so important. And so what we really wanted to do is, this whole program is about community knowledge and expertise. And so when we were really building this peer connections between them, because we understood that, one, that was in the ethos of the program, but secondly, this is something that is going to be long-standing. This connectivity, the learning between all the different organizations is going to be so valuable. And then finally, in terms of the learning in general, obviously a lot of that learning was relational. We were very much focused on reflective practice. Rather than, we didn't ask any of the projects for reports. We check in to ask how the partnership's going. For example, we don't even need to ask about the numbers or the outcomes, as it were, because we were much more interested in the process. What is the researcher learning from this process? Is a very uncomfortable way of working. And similarly, what kind of impacts are the community seeing, and how are they feeling confident around this type of work? So, two last quick things before we kind of be interested to kind of get some perspectives back. I don't know if this has been blocked, but one of the key things that we really noticed, so by the end of the program with climate change, and it's still ongoing, I should say, the Ideas Fund and our climate change network, we've had about 35 of these projects. And unsurprisingly, what really came out from the fore was that very often this work happened in spite of the system, right? So things like funding applications, generally speaking, don't reward this way of working. Even for the researchers, we had to acknowledge that because we weren't asking for the researchers to publish papers, unless the community groups wanted to do that, researchers weren't also considered the principal investigator of the program because the money and the contracts went directly to the community partners. And so, for example, what I would say is developing good practice and strong practice, but that's not necessarily rewarded by the conventional reward pathways of academia, and that is a problem. We also had things like ethics processes that were big barriers. Again, most ethics processes assume that the university is leading, and that wasn't the case. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about these kind of infrastructure pieces. And then with a separate grant, we developed a kind of wider network, an advocacy network called Community Knowledge Matters, which was co-developed as a name with our partners. And we're doing a lot of different things. I'm not going to go into too many details, but the idea around this is that, well, we've got a few years of funding to think about, well, what can we change in the system, both in the Highlands and Islands and the wider UK, to enable this way of working to happen, to enable communities to lead research and to genuinely lead, not just, be kind of instrumentalized or asked. There's a few things that we've done. A lot of it is around network building. So we've opened this up to anyone, actually, but bringing policymakers, researchers, as well as, of course, the center, which is community groups, together. Recognizing that language is a big barrier. We all not language necessarily in terms of like English, French, German, but thinking even just like, and when we're saying the same words, very often it means different things. And language can be used when we're bringing groups together to actually, if you're using lots of technical language, that was excluding people and making them feel not welcome. So we spent a lot of time thinking about living glossary. We're developing a new ethics process. Just because a project doesn't go through a university ethics process doesn't mean it's not ethical. And actually, I would say that communities know how ethical working works better than maybe some academics on an ethics panel. And so we're developing a new ethics tool, which enables communities to set the terms of how they want to be engaged in research, how they want to be acknowledged or paid or anonymous or not anonymous, and really enabling it so almost the dynamic becomes, rather than a researcher coming in and saying, here's my ethics form, you need to sign your consent, it's actually the communities who have the ability to set this, and then researchers come and they have to sign the consent form and they have to agree with the communities. And obviously, again, it's more complicated than this, but doing this type of work. And then the final point I'll mention is we've got a co-priority survey, which was working with rural communities across Scotland who haven't been funded by us to set the agenda of how they want to be researched around mental well-being. And then finally, policy change. We really want to get involved in research because they want to see an impact. And one of the things we really identified was that we believe that obviously the really good quality data was being developed. Communities' peer research models are asking better questions very often. They're analyzing the data, they get a much richer understanding with the support of a researcher. What happens if policymakers like the Scottish Government or the NHS, they don't value this work? It doesn't look like traditional research and therefore it's not valued the same. And so we spend a lot of time now working with these policymakers, working with funders to say, actually, it's you that has to change. And actually you have to increase in their understanding of the value of this type of approach and why it can lead to better quality research, evidence, monitoring, and actually be used for policy change and system change as well. Okay, so there's a lot there. I guess just a quick mention, I mentioned this in fellowship. So alongside this work, so you're all very welcome to join the Community Knowledge Matters Network, and this is ongoing. But I've also just started a fellowship with the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, which is based in Bristol. And a lot of this work is thinking about this wider question. So how can the system be reimagined, changed to enable more equitable power dynamics and inclusive knowledge production with historically marginalized communities? And so I guess the main call out here, and I'm still in the research and kind of development phase of my fellowship, which will run until next year, but it's thinking about, I want to draw lots of different examples of what is system change from different sectors, from internationally, not just from within Scotland or the UK, and thinking much wider, because if we're thinking about how knowledge production is going to change by 2040, the whole world is going to be very different. You know, our economic model, climate change is going to completely fundamentally affect these things. And we can't separate that from engagement. So I'll be looking for different ideas about this. Maybe this, I welcome any thoughts and perspectives on this, developing a series of conversations, and then hopefully developing a toolkit. It won't be too much of a toolkit, but a reflective tool to enable others to kind of share this learning, but bring in different voices, bringing kind of very senior people who could enact system change with activists, the grassroots, together. I guess maybe just in terms of summary, you won't be surprised, I'm sure we're all allies in this, but again, think about equity, thinking about actually, you know, how funding is set up, is that it's not set up to allow communities to truly lead. Intermediaries are key, and very often you guys will be intermediaries, science engagement professionals, museums. But I guess maybe to summarize, I'm also very aware that there are power dynamics in terms of the institutions of science centers and museums. And again, there's this question that can be of actually how could we enable more community engagement? And we, for example, worked with the Museums Association, sorry, not the Museums Association, Museums Gallery Scotland, to think about a grant scheme which did a similar thing, where communities themselves could set the agenda, set a project. They would then match with the museum, but the funding went directly to the community partners, not through the museum. And that enabled very different things to happen. And how do we do all this work with an ethics of care? So I'm going to finish it there. There's probably more reflections, but I guess as we go into breakouts, and then really welcome your thoughts. Yeah, thank you for listening. And obviously we've got a small team, and I don't do this work alone. So I want to thank them, of course. And I guess maybe the thought to leave you on is, in your breakout groups, is what areas of the system, and your own systems might look very different. Obviously, every country will have different systems, but particularly institutional systems, funding systems, help. What are you excited by? Are there examples of system change that enable community-led engagement in the way that we're talking about? And what needs to change? And I imagine that there might be a lot more thoughts about this as well. And I will stop there. To myself. There we go. Great, I can see you all.
Thanks, Lewis. That was really good.
Great. So I'm going to copy those questions into the chat. And then please, I mean, if you've got any questions, please let me know. I guess maybe, yeah, I don't know if do we want to have a little bit of time for questions, or do we want to go into breakouts? This is democracy, so. Christina.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Lewis. Thank you very much for this presentation. My question is the size of your project. So, how many people do you manage to engage? What are the size of the groups you work with? Things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, it's for example, so we have 15 projects that we supported with the Climate Change Network. And those would range from tiny collectives of like 2 or 3 people, very grassroots communities that weren't constituted, all the way. We do have some bigger organizations in there. But again, even in those, in the decision making, we were very critical about kind of what charities were involved and did they genuinely support lived experience, so people with that experience, disabled people or LGBTQ people, to be involved in it and leading the discussion. So there's a massive range of that. What's interesting is I couldn't even give you a number in terms of the impact of the participants, because actually ultimately that's, once we funded the program, we're supporting them, but we're not there to kind of ask them what was their big reach. What we're most interested in, what was the impact it had on them as an organization. And we've seen some really strong examples. For example, one completely youth-led project in Shetland has now set up a new charity where everyone is a young person and in Shetland, and they've embedded research as a big part of how they operate. And they're now starting to work with the Shetland Council to make big changes based on the research that they're doing. And actually, one of the young people who've been involved as the researchers just been awarded one of the top under 30 young women in Scotland as a peer researcher and youth researcher. So yeah, I don't have in terms of scale, I can't give you a number because for us, it's much more about that qualitative difference it's making in terms of the communities.
Thank you.
Any other clarifying questions?
Lewis, can I just quickly ask, did you say you're funded by the Wellcome Trust?
Yeah, so the Ideas Fund is funded by Wellcome Trust. We've got our final allocation of Wellcome funding. So it's interestingly, this was funded by Wellcome, but then their strategy changed, which again, think about funding structures. We've all been there before, and so they do, in terms of our kind of influence of Wellcome. We have key actors who are very supportive, but basically they've agreed that we have until 2027 of funding, which is great, to make the biggest difference we can in terms of getting other funders to do this type of work. So we've already started to influence UK Research and Innovation, which is the biggest research funder in the UK, through our climate change network as well. Yeah, but after that, we'll get no more funding from Wellcome, but we do have a few years to think about what's the biggest impact that we can make with this in terms of the learning. Though, I mean, if I was being cheeky, I would say the biggest influence we should be making is back to Wellcome. But anyway, Aoife.
Yeah, sorry, just actually to add on that question, I suppose if you are, because I know your funding will eventually end for Wellcome, but how do you navigate tensions between the funders that are funding you and the requirements that they often set, let's say with KPIs and final reports, when you don't want to implement that then on the people that you're providing the funding with, and also kind of being given the funding, but yeah, try to change these structures. So I was wondering how you navigate those tensions.
That's a great question, and I'm going to give the very honest response, and I'll probably redact it from the recording. Wellcome it's delegated funding, so they've given the grant to the British Science Association, and then we manage that grant. The benefit of that is that they actually have been very hands-off, which is great. So that's the reason why Wellcome is third biggest research funder in the world, and they can do what they want, and so they're not really accountable to anyone. So ultimately, that's given us the biggest amount of freedom to, for example, to say this is what's allowed us to fund groups that who've never been funded before, who don't have a constitution. It's given us a massive amount of flexibility to say, we're not asking you to count how many people you've engaged and give us a tick box answer. That has given us a massive amount of freedom. Now, the only flip side to that is it does mean that because we're quite so delegated, so independent, it does make influencing Wellcome themselves very difficult because they've kind of now just given this money away and they're not involved. If I contrast that to UK Research and Innovation, who funds our climate change network, they're very hands-on, and that's me being in all the best ways, but with all the challenges. And our work, we work very closely with the UKRI team, and we had to do a lot of work kind of navigating things and saying no to stuff. So they wanted to be on the panel, and we told them they should not be on the panel, and actually it should be community members who are making part of that decision. And they acquiesced, they agreed with that. And that's actually since influenced some of the other, panels, because they've traditionally always been on the panel. And so there's a lot of things there's a lot more. So our role, this is where that partnership work has been so important, was really mediating and being this is not appropriate to ask for the community partners. This is a small grant. But there's no doubt that UKRI, which is arm's length from the government, for example, has much more requirements for accountability of the funding. They were less flexible, and we pushed it as far as we could, but there's no doubt compared to Wellcome that they were less flexible. So, but to be fair, our evaluation report for the Climate Change Network is taking us a very long time, and a lot of improvements. But it will be published in the next week, actually, and so I'm very happy to share it with folks. But it does talk about this very interesting partnership that we've had with them, and some of the kind of even just the process of internally, not with the communities, that we've had to push back on this, have flexibility in this. But there's no doubt that there's a lot more confines, but it is hopefully starting to influence how they run these types of programs in future.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I'm totally going to remove that from the recording. But also, UK really cared about this program. Like we were, you know, a lot of the community groups that we involved were like signposted at the launch with the CEO, for example. Like it made a massive impact in some ways in terms of the ways of working. It was quite, and so that's the flip side. Whereas I would say welcome, quite honestly, is like they've moved on from this, right? And now they're doing international work, which is part of their strategy, and all of this work that we have that they literally funded, they're kind of like, oh yeah, cool. So that's the balance, right? And I very much appreciate when I talk to funders in Europe and thinking about the big funders. I think this is one of my big questions with thinking about those of you who are in Europe. And, you know, if we think we're bureaucratic, my understanding is that most European funders are like next level in terms of how strict they are. I don't know if you're, you know, give me a nod if that feels right or not, but, you know, this idea of delegated funding. So for us to be able to be this intermediary to hold funding is actually, again, you know, I think actually in Horizon 2020, like the EU grants, that's only just started to happen to enable this kind of delegated funding model. So I think there's some learning, and I'd be really interested to hear people's perspectives on that.